Hello, everyone. Hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of an extra slice of history with the butterfly princess. In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing education in the Victorian era. The title of this lesson is entitled Education in the Victorian Era, a Transformative Period. Introduction. The Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, was a period of immense social, economic, and technological change in Britain. Education underwent significant transformation during this time, evolving from a system largely based on religious charity and private initiatives to one increasingly shaped by state intervention and standardised practices. This lecture will explore the history, challenges, and key developments in Victorian education, including the introduction of educational acts, the role of charity schools, the experiences of students and teachers, and examples from Victorian literature. Historical context and key facts. At the beginning of the Victorian era, education was neither compulsory nor free for the majority of the population. Several types of schools existed. Dame schools, these were small private schools, usually run by women in their homes providing basic education. Grammar schools focused on classical education, primarily but for boys from wealthier families. Charity schools, funded by religious organisations and philanthropists aimed at educating the poor. Sunday schools offered religious instruction and basic literacy on Sundays, often the only form of education for working class children. Key figures and numbers. In 1833, the government made its first grant of £20,000 to aid in the construction of schools. By 1870, approximately 40% of children attended school. The 1870 Education Act aimed to provide primary education for all children aged between 5 and 12 years of age. By 1880, education was compulsory for children aged between 5 and 10 years of age. The school leaving age was gradually raised, reaching 12 by the age of 12 by the year of 1899. Challenges in Victorian education. Despite progress, Victorian education faced numerous challenges. Poverty. Many families needed their children to work to supplement income, leading to irregular school attendance. Lack of resources. Schools often suffered from inequalities, inadequate funding, poor facilities, and a shortage of trained teachers. School inequalities. Access to quality education varied greatly depending on social class, with the wealthy receiving a far superior education. Religious divisions, disputes between the Church of England and non-conformists over control of schools hindered the development of a unified system. Education Act and legislative reforms. Several key pieces of legislation shaped Victorian education. The Education Act of 1870, Forester Act. This landmark act established school boards to fill gaps in educational provision, aiming to provide primary education for all children aged between 5 to 12 years of age. It allowed for compulsory attendance and the creation of board schools funded by local rates. The Education Act of 1880 made school attendance compulsory for children aged between the ages of 5 and 10 years of age. The Education Act of 1891 abolished fees for elementary education, making it free for all. Student and teacher experiences. Students. Victorian classrooms were often large and overcrowded, with strict discipline enforced through corporal punishment. The curriculum focused on the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, with an emphasis on rote learning and memorization. Girls typically received a different education than boys, with a focus on domestic skills and accomplishments. Teachers. Many teachers were poorly trained and underpaid, especially in the early Victorian period. Pupil-teacher systems. A common method of training involved older students, pupil teachers assisting experienced teachers while receiving instruction themselves. Normal schools, teacher training colleges. These institutions began to emerge, providing more formal training for teachers, charity schools, and different classes of education. Charity schools. These schools often run by religious organisations, providing basic education to poor children. The curriculum emphasised religious instruction, literacy, and practical skills to prepare children for employment. Education by class. Upper-class wealthier families often hired governesses or sent their sons to prestigious private schools like Eton or Harrow, focusing on classical education and preparing them for leadership roles. Middle class children attended grammar schools or private academies with a curriculum that balanced classical and modern subjects, preparing them for professional careers. Working class children attended charity schools or board schools, receiving a basic education aimed at improving literacy and numeracy for employment. Teaching methods and techniques. Rote learning. Memorization were common methods, with students repeating facts and passages. The monitored systems utilised older students' monitors to teach younger students, allowing one teacher to manage a large class. Object lessons introduced by educators like Johann Henrik Passer. These lessons use concrete objects to teach abstract concepts. Reading and writing. Children learn to read using primary religious texts. Writing was taught through copy exercises and dictation. Slate boards and chalks were commonly used to practice Victorian literature and education. Victorian literature provides rich insights into the educational practices and values of the time. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte depicts Jane's experiences at Lowood School, highlighting the harsh conditions and inequalities in charitable institutions. And there's a scene in the book where Jane is dreading the impending visit by Mr. Brocklehurst, and when she recognises him, she drops her slate in fright, and that is how Mr. Brocklehurst picks her out from the class tells the whole students and all the teachers what a disobedient child she is. Jane Lace becomes a governess, reflecting the limited career options for educated women. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens follows David's education, showcasing the different types of schools and the impact of education on social mobility. Great Expectations, also by Charles Dickens. Pip's journey reflects the transformative power of education and social class as he receives an education to become a gentleman. The Governess by Sarah Fielding explores the life and challenges faced by governesses in wealthy households. And I've come up now with a fictional story about Victorian education. This fictional story is called A Day in the Life of a Victorian Schoolgirl. Eliza Chapman was a bright, inquisitive girl of 10, attending a board school in Manchester in 1885. Her day began before dawn, helping her mother with chores before walking the mile to school. The classroom was a large drafty room filled with rows of desks. Mr. Grimshaw, the stern schoolmaster, maintained order with a long wooden pointer. The morning lessons included reading from the Bible, writing on slate boards, and arithmetic. Eliza excelled in her studies, easily absorbing knowledge. However, she often struggled with the rigid discipline and the pressures to conform. During a reading lesson, Eliza's mind wandered to the textile mill where her older brother worked. She dreamed of a different future, one where she could use her education to become a teacher or writer. Mr. Grimshaw noticed her intention and called her to the front of the class. Eliza Chapman, can you recite the poem we learned yesterday? He demanded. Eliza, flustered, stumbled through the verses, earning a disapproving glare from Mr. Grimshaw. After school, she helped her mother with sewing, her thoughts returning to her dreams. Despite the challenges, Eliza remained determined to make the most of her education, seeing it as her only path to a better life. Conclusion now about Victoria. So that ends my fictional story, and this is the conclusion to today's lesson. Education in the Victorian era was a period of significant change and development. From the early days of charity schools and limited access to the reforms brought about by the Education Act, the Victorian era laid the foundations for the modern education system in Britain. Despite the challenges of poverty, inequality, and religious divisions, the era saw a growing recognition of the importance of education for individuals and social progress is reflected in the literature and social reforms of the time. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, now concludes this week's edition of An Extra Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. I hope you've enjoyed today's this week's instalment, and I very much hope you can join me next week for next week's instalment. But until then, have a lovely rest of your week. Take care, and I will see you very soon. Bye bye for now.